So what is interesting, that speaks to the fact that OpenAI is unquestionably playing long ball. They're playing big ball here, right? And then
Mhm.
the question though is that in fact that's the bet they're making? And there's been a couple of interesting moves that you brought up from an article standpoint that is sort of pointing to, well, maybe the actual pathway to the future is the opposite, not going big, but instead going small. And I'll cue this up for you. You pointed out two different articles, wildly different, but both sort of pointing the same direction. The first is NVIDIA kind of quietly actually announced a much less expensive Blackwell chip,
Mhm.
mostly trying to get around export curves, but I think also leading into this idea that organizations are trying to find more cost-effective ways to operationalize all this technology. And then another article in the Register talking about something we talked about over a year ago, and this is this idea of models using the mixture of experts strategy and approach to try to get more efficient models, particularly in inference, right, and not
Yes.
during training. And both of these are sort of pointing to the same lines of like what DeepSeek represented. This idea, of course, they were on the training side mostly, but focusing on how you can do more with less and actually start reducing the cost, which I think everyone agrees is going to be really critical to the operationalization of all of these AI technologies. And so it is interesting to see Google I/O and OpenAI making this acquisition. Clear, both companies clearly sticking to the big swing sort of approach,
Mhm.
and then these conversations that are kind of saying, hey, what does this other option look like? So I mean, how did you read those two articles?
Yeah, there's been so much focus, obviously, starting with OpenAI saying that bigger is better. The end. We need to pour more data into the models. We need to get the models as big as possible, and then we need to put them in the biggest computing areas that are possible. And then that is the way that we are going to create these trillion-dollar companies or whatever. But there's another school of thought saying that AI is actually better when it's constrained, when you're creating limits, when you have specific goals that you are focused on. And that's part of what DeepSeek was based on, that China did not have the latest and greatest NVIDIA chips on hand. So they had to find more efficient ways of being able to test and create models, which led to DeepSeek and then the quick follow-ups by the likes of Alibaba Quen, and then leading to us in America also following suit from an open source perspective. And that is probably going to be an important piece of the puzzle, that China has figured out how to do AI research without necessarily having the fastest chips, because they are able to do more work at the, call it, assembly language level, the the Kuja level of NVIDIA. So they're going to be doing more work there. And now with this new chip that NVIDIA is bringing out for China, yes, it gets around some of the import export issues that they're running into with the United States from a tariff perspective. That limits the level of power that they can export to other companies, but it also probably builds into a Chinese R&D method that we don't necessarily have as much here in the United States, where they can use these lower power chips in bulk and under those compute constraints, create some new AI capabilities that are going to end up surprising us. They're going to find more efficient models and more efficient techniques over time, simply because they are resource constrained, and that actually leads them to be able to be do some interesting things from an AI perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a school of thought right now that abundance is actually potentially working against the at least U.S. interest when it
Mhm.
comes to the development of AI, because there's so much money and so much compute and all of this. What I do think is interesting is I think this movement towards smaller, more purpose-built and tailored solutions, I think, is gaining a lot of quiet ground. It doesn't get the news. I mean, both these articles, like neither of these crossed my path, right? I missed them. They're not getting anywhere near the same splash, right, from a news standpoint. But like Microsoft, I think it has in their library now has over 100 small language models
Mhm.
for enterprises to pick and choose from to try to build against specific apps. And I think that we're going to see more and more of this, where that just becomes, I think, the default. Um,
Right.
so.
And
Yeah,
from a
it's
practical perspective, the Register article we talked about, where AI models are evolving, it brings up the idea of mixture of expert models, which we've talked about before on this show. And the idea that although these mixture of expert models may also have billions and billions of parameters, they are actually segmented internally so that you may only have to tag, call it 2 or 3 out of 15 different regions to get a certain answer. And those answers may actually be better at the end of the day than the one uniform, gigantic 300 billion or trillion parameter model that might exist from a general perspective. But part of the challenge is those models are probably cheaper to train and maintain over time. And it's not as sexy to talk about, call it a $500,000 project as much as a $50 million project, even if the $500,000 project gives you more value at the end of the day.
I think, it's the traditional hype cycle. I think we're going to find a lot of the value happens at this under the radar sort of level, and I think that's going to be the sign that we're finally hitting mainstream with all of this. So, in the end, I think it's good. What is